live.
Hey, welcome everybody.
Not our usual Tim Golden mega host on here. So the other side of Team Tim and Jesse will take it this week. But welcome back. Great episode ahead here. With I think we're going to dive a little deeper than we usually dive in the security conversation, just given Jason and Jordan's experience. So I'm Tim Schnurr from Cabello, data discovery and classification platform. Jesse, you want to go? And I'm hoping we can kind of dig really deep into, both Jordan's background and Jason, just because they're pretty rich and varied experiences coming through security. So
Yeah, no, I'm super excited for the show. Let's just start with that. Jason and Jordan, guys that have seen it all when it comes to incidents and breaches, probably on a much higher repetitive basis than a lot of our normal listeners. So I'm really excited we talk about education. I'm really excited to get some anecdotes, some stories, some ammunition for our MSPs to go talk to their clients and give some real world examples of what can happen to help educate. So all that said, I'm Jesse Miller, founder of Power PSA Consulting. We help MSPs build and scale security programs for profit. And with that, I want to give as much time as I can to Jason Rebholz from Corvus Insurance. Jason, give us a little bit of your history and kind of we've talked before your winding road to the CISO of an insurance company.
Yeah, and not anything I planned either, which makes it even that much more exciting. So really what got me into security was a Rubik's Cube. And it sounds absolutely ridiculous, but when I was in high school, I started speed solving Rubik's Cubes. And at that same exact time, I was learning how to program. And so there was this blending of just technology and puzzles that I fell in love with. And I stumbled into the security aspect because as I was learning to program, I also learned that I didn't want to do that as a career. And so that introduced me into computer networking, thanks to a really good teacher that I had. And that stumbled me into the security aspect. And I just loved it. And so I dove in and, I went to school at the Rochester Institute of Technology. That gave me a good primer on systems administration, computer networking, and security. And then I, again, stumbled into my first job, which I didn't deserve, at Mandiant. I applied for a job that I wasn't qualified for, but as luck would have it, they were just starting to hire college students. And so I was one of the very first college hires that Mandiant ever made. I like to think it wasn't a mistake on their part. And so for me, it was a really good opportunity to just be a sponge and learn how to do incident response, because I was sitting in a room with some of the smartest minds in digital forensics, in incident response, in malware reverse engineering, and even just project management, right? And it's just like that perfect ecosystem that allowed me to learn how do you run really large-scale investigations dealing with very sophisticated threat actors. And so with my time at Mandiant, I did a bunch of investigations into nation-state threats. Saw things that still scare me today, and just the capabilities that they have. I did a lot with hacktivists. If anyone remembers Anonymous and LulzSec, which is, probably 12, 13 years ago at this point, I investigated a bunch of their systems, and so saw how hacktivists worked in a decentralized yet centralized manner. And where I found my passion was really financial crime. And so that was about the time when credit card breaches were happening all the time, right? Brick and mortar stores get some malware on these point of sale systems and steal credit cards. And so I did hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of those types of investigations. And then, after being at Mandiant for a while, I got this urge to just go back to in a startup world, because by this time, FireEye had bought Mandiant. And so it just became a big company. And I wanted to get back to the roots of, really helping customers solve their incidents, not just solve the incidents and push product. And so I went back, went to a company called Crypsis Group, and I was employee number 5 there, and took over their professional services and built that out. And at this time, this is really where I dove headfirst into insurance, because insurance was a vehicle to get work. So, just like if you get car insurance, right? Like car insurance, carriers who sell car insurance have deals with various vendors and mechanics all over the U.S. and wherever else, so that they get better rates. And so it's the same thing with incident response. And so I built really good relationships with insurance carriers, and in return, I got a lot of work from that. And so I rode that startup wave for a while. Did Cryptsys for a while. I then took what I call my sabbatical and did some time doing partnerships and business development at a network detection and response company. And then they got acquired by a company called Gigamon. And then from there, went back to essentially startup world again, co-founded a company. And it was one of those classic things with startups where you think you're going to be doing one thing, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I'm actually getting money from over here, so I'm going to lean into that, and found myself doing incident response again. Yeah. But in this case, it was on ransomware recovery. And so how do you get somebody back up and running after they get hit with ransomware? And so this is just, again, crazy timing with everything. We had decided early on when we started doing this that we were going to build a network of various MSPs that could do the hands-on work. And so we had a partner network all over the US right as COVID hit. And so we became one of the only shops out there that could really get people quickly on site in the middle of COVID, like early stage COVID too, where like nobody knew what was going on. And so that was just rocket fuel. Unfortunately for me, when I left Cryptsys, I never wanted to do incident response again. And so I found myself building another incident response company. It was an amazing experience just looking at it from a different lens. And I put a good framework in place, was able to train the team up. And that's when I realized that, you know what, I need to try a different type of challenge. And having grown up in more of the consulting kind of persona and doing a little bit on partnerships and business development, the one thing I never really had was working in industry and owning a security program. And so as I was looking at where I wanted to go with my career, I said, you know what, I have this option to go build companies, or I have this option to go try internal security. And I was literally talking with an investor buddy of mine. He goes, everybody loves a former CISO. I was like, great. That sounds perfect. So let me go try this out.
Except when they're part of a breach.
Yeah, exactly. That's hopefully I can avoid that.
Yeah.
But so that's where I jumped into it. So it's been over 2 years now, building out security programs, and I have, because I can never do anything by the book. I always have to have like a unique spin on things, and so I have a very unique CISO role because I'm in cyber insurance. So I own internal security, but I also run a threat intel team that looks at where are all the threats going and what are the attacks, how are they happening, so that we can try to, one, help our underwriters assess the risks more accurately. And more importantly, how do we help all of our policyholders secure their environment against the future of attacks, let alone what we've been dealing with for the last 15 years. Right. And so that takes up a bulk of my time. And we also have a risk advisory team. It's like, little mini VCISOs, if you will, and a little bit of like a customer success team to just all really focus in on how do we help our underwriters have the right technical knowledge when they're assessing risk, and then how do we make sure that our policyholders are in the best position to defend themselves. And so, I like to pack 4 jobs into one, and so that's how I spend my time.
Well, I saw a snippet as well under like analytics, and if we can come back to that, we will. It sounds like it's kind of your pet project, or you're like really trying to hone in on like what are the things that matter, and that's a big theme that Jesse and I have had here on the show. So if we have time at that, we'll come back to the end. But go ahead, Jesse. Sorry.
No, just a question popped into my mind while you were talking, and I'm sure people ask you this. If you had to put a number on it, how many incidents would you say you've worked? Breaches. Let's put it that way.
Over 1,000. Wow. And I can say that definitively because I got deposed one time and I said that, and I had to literally go back and give the math behind that. And so, it's been, it's 12, 13 years, or, at least 10. I always lose track of doing it. And the thing that, people forget is that, especially when you're dealing with smaller environments, I could be running 5 or 6 engagements at a single time myself. Right. And so never dropping the ball on quality, mind you, which is very important. But, a lot of these attacks are, I always say it's like playing Mad Libs, right? So like once you learn the playbook, it's literally just going and saying, okay, where's all the evidence to help me understand what's going on? Right. You find that, you interpret it, you pop out some reports, and you look for any outliers in there as well. Because, there is a lot of creativity in hacking, but a lot of it still comes down to what is a repeatable process that these groups can do at scale.
Right. I love that. I want to come back to that. So I want to give Jordan some time to give us his background as well, because it's interesting. Jason is on the tail end of the attack, where I feel like Jordan is on the front lines of the attack. Jordan, you want to tell us, give us your history, what Quadrant does, and fill us in with where you fit into the attack cycle.
Sure. Yeah, happy to do that. So thanks for having me here. It's definitely a privilege to be here with Jason. Jason and I know each other a little bit, and we have a lot of crossover actually in our background. But I started in security when I joined a consulting firm called Strauss Friedberg back in 2018. At the time, Strauss was doing primarily incident response and digital forensics. And I actually came in as the chief marketing officer. So I joined because the guy who ran the company at the time had been a very senior partner at McKinsey. And I went through the interview process and I just thought, this is going to be good for my career. I'm going to work for a guy who ran a big part of McKinsey. That's going to be really good. And it was fantastic. But really, the people at Strauss Friedberg were brilliant at what they did. And it was a great opportunity to learn security from them. So I made my career in security by putting myself next to smart people like Jason and absorbing what they're telling me, so that I can tell their stories to the outside world, so that people want to come and work with the companies that I'm working with. So I spent a few years at Strauss Friedberg. While I was there, we acquired two other companies, one called Gotham Digital Science, which was at the time a premier pen testing firm started by four guys who met while they were all working at EY and realized pretty quickly that they were too smart for that. So they started their own business, built up this fantastic business where they were entrepreneurial, but they took the rigor, the methodology that they learned at EY and applied it in that small business, and were incredibly good at it. So we acquired Gotham, and we acquired another company that did intellectual property due diligence, so looking at intellectual property in the context of acquisitions and try to determine whether that IP is intact. Is it out there in the wild? Is someone monetizing it other than the company that owns it? And that's largely a digital forensic type job right now. So we acquired those two companies, and then we went into our own recapitalization process and spoke to 40, 50 different potential investors, and ultimately were acquired by Aon, the insurance broker. So here's where it starts to get interesting. Aon had this idea, and this is back already in I want to say 2018, that it would be a good idea to acquire a company that has a lot of information about breaches, because it's very hard to understand how to price insurance where you're going to have to cover the cost of a breach, because no one really understands breaches enough. We don't know how often they're going to happen. We don't know how big they're going to be, what damage they're going to do. Those are the hallmarks of how you price an insurance policy. So they figured, we'll get Strauss. Strauss does lots of incidents. They do lots of assessments. All that data is going to help us get smart, and we'll be better at helping insurance companies price this risk, and we'll be the leaders. This was Aon's idea. So I went in there. I became the COO of that business unit, which was essentially a combination of Aon's cyber brokerage business and the Strauss consulting business. And I spent 2.5 years trying to put those two businesses together. And turn it into what Aon wanted it to be. Over that time, a lot of I don't know when you were at Crypsis, Jason, but you probably were on the receiving end of a lot of people from Strauss at that time.
Yes.
Something about the cultural mismatch between cybersecurity experts and insurance people. I don't know. Interesting. We could talk about that. But in any event, part of what I did while I was there was actually help Strauss Friedberg launch itself into the insured incident response business, because up to that point, Strauss's brand in IR had really been more top tier white shoe, and we had really eschewed and self-selected out of the insured part of the incident response market, because the pricing was being driven down and there were a lot of players coming into it that frankly we thought didn't have the same skill set that we did, and so we sort of left that part of the market to them. But ultimately, the insurance companies really took over the demand side of incident response at some point. And we had no choice but to get into it. Now, luckily, we were owned by Aon, so that gave us a bit of an in with insurance companies, and actually with breach lawyers as well, because among other things, Aon provides insurance to law firms. And so we were able to use some of those relationships to get in there and start to build up that business. We had to develop a relationship with companies that negotiated and paid ransomware in Bitcoin, which was a fun process at a regulated insurance company that's extremely risk averse. So all kinds of adventures there, just trying to make that business work. But finished that up around the end of 2019 and decided a little bit like Jason described that I wanted to get back to doing something for a smaller company. Having been at Strauss and then absorbed into Aon, the juxtaposition was pretty stark for me. So someone I know who's a partner at a private equity firm had just bought a security company in Toronto called Security Compass. Security Compass at the time had two businesses, a software business and an advisory business. And the private equity firm didn't really invest in it for the advisory side, even though that was a very strong business and the original business of Security Compass. But they asked me to go in there and lead that business to the point where it could be carved out and sold to somebody else. I'm originally from Toronto, so that's just coincidental, but it was great. I was flying up there every week, going to work, visiting my mom and my brother who still lived there. And then maybe 2 months after I started, COVID hit. So I had just started meeting people, just started trying to figure out what was going on there, and then never went to Toronto again, basically. But we got to about November 2020, so a few months into the pandemic, and I was starting to realize that I wasn't going to achieve what they wanted me to achieve sitting locked in my house in Brooklyn at the time. And just started to get on the road. And I spoke to a bunch of potential investors, all of whom, in spite of what was going on in the world, seemed to be very excited about putting money into a company like Security Compass. And I went back to the private equity firm that owned it and said, guys, I think we should be talking to people now. Because something's going on in the market, and I think this might be the right time. And we went back and forth on that for a little while, but eventually kicked off a process that took the better part of 2021 and ended up carving out Security Compass Advisory and selling it to Kroll at the end of 21. Yeah, so I had the great fortune of being at Kroll for 6 months to help with that integration, working for the guy who runs cyber over there. His name's Jason Smolenoff, an ex-Strauss guy. We didn't know each other there. We missed each other by a few minutes, but Jason's a great guy. We know a lot of the same people, speak the same language. So it was a really unlikely experience I had previously with the Strauss sale. The process of getting integrated into Kroll was a great one, really smooth. And I think a lot of that was driven by the leaders there really taking a personal interest in helping to make it work. So after that finished and I finished my stint with Kroll, I went back into the market and did the same thing again. Looked for a private equity firm that was investing in cyber and trying to figure out if we could work together on a thesis that I was interested in. And at the time, I was really looking at the alignment between MSPs and managed security firms, and how they fit together to support the needs of small and medium-sized customers, particularly in the post-COVID era. And got introduced to these two guys who started a private equity firm to do exactly that, to invest in MSPs and MSSPs. They had made a couple of acquisitions at that time. They've since closed another on the MSP side. And I'm now running Quadrant, which is their anchor investment on the security side. Quadrant is a cybersecurity consulting firm. We work with mainly small and medium-sized companies to assess their security posture, try to make practical, highly prioritized recommendations about what they can do to make progress, really try to be incremental about it and realistic. And then we also provide managed detection and response for those companies.
Awesome.
Yep. So that's the story.
Yeah, that's
awesome.
Yeah, practical applications that are actionable. I think we'll get along just fine.
Yeah. Interesting. You said the advisory business as well. Like, they weren't really interested in that. They were interested in that recurring revenue, right? So I don't think we had an episode, Jesse, where we're talking about selling MSPs or MSSPs, but like it's all about that recurring rev aspect. But go ahead. Yeah. I'm interrupting.
No, I'm really glad that both Jason and Jordan got a chance to kind of fill us in on their background, because I want to position them as the experts that they are to really get us leveled and diving deep into this discussion of authentication.
Yeah.
And so, since Tim is traveling, Tim Golden, I'm going to take a page out of his book and let's define authentication, right? What's your definition of authentication? What does that mean, right? So we're going to go back to your CISSP textbook, everyone, and say, I'll go with Jason first. Jason, authentication, what is it? What's the category?
Yeah, and hopefully you don't grade me based on the CISSP here. But for me, it's really proving who you are, right? And what you have the permissions to do and what to access. So, but it comes back to that core of, are you who you say you are? And, what does that, depending who you are, what does that allow you to do? What does that allow you to access?
Okay. So follow on to that, Jordan, are authentication and identity interchangeable, the same? Does one build on the other? How do you see identity versus authentication?
Well, I think identity is the noun, let's say. Authentication is the process by which we verify your identity, who you say you are.
Right.
And I think authentication also brings in the context, right? So we're not just proving that you are who you say you are, but we're trying to understand what it is you're allowed to do based on that identity in that context.
Yeah, I think that's right, spot on, and I love the categorization of the noun and the. I'm going to tuck that one.
And I think and I think that context is something that's grown dramatically, right, over the years, right? Like it used to just be, oh yeah, whatever, just very simple, and now it's multi-factor authentication, right? So it's all context based, and it's going even more to context based, I think, as we get further along, just because it'll need to be more sophisticated. So
to pontificate or maybe be a little esoteric, I want to pose something that I was thinking about before the show today. Is authentication the linchpin or the core of security?
Sorry, I thought you were going to ask about the meaning of life.
It could lead into that. All right, don't put a limit on me. I may go there.
Well, I'll take the broken record answer of what we talk about CIS controls all the time, and clearly we've seen it come down the prioritization list. So is it the end of be all? No, but it's certainly he's got a comment on here as well, so we'll show that real quick. But it's certainly dominating the whole zero. I don't like to say zero trust, least trust, but it's certainly become more important, right? And it's interesting because Jordan talked about his background, or Jason talked about his background about ransomware before 2020, which was like almost non-existent, right? So like authentication became such a massive role going forward. So
I think it's interesting because you talk about how with CIS, I think it was, right, where authentication is kind of getting pushed on the list, which seems crazy to me.
Yeah.
Right? Because at the end of the day, and again, my lens is how does an attack actually happen, right?
Yeah.
And so you have kind of two worlds that we're living in right now. You have your legacy environments, heavy on-premise, maybe some hybrid with cloud, whatever. And then you have this new reality of a cloud native company, right? And that, like, two very, very different things on how you defend. But there's one commonality between both of those that attackers need to get in order to be successful with most attacks, especially when we're talking ransomware. And that is an account that allows them to do something to go closer to their objective, right? So on premise, whatever they do to get in, they need to find a domain admin account in a Windows environment to start moving around and give them the right permissions to be able to do that, right? And when it comes down to authentication, great. If you put all the MFA in the world in place on the external side, guess what's really difficult to do and most people don't do on the inside? Put MFA for those domain admin accounts because it's a pain. And it's really difficult to do it the right way, especially when you're trying to do interactive logons or non-interactive logons, which is the even harder thing. And so that all comes down to say, with Keith's comment, right, on authorization being separate, right? It's 100%. The problem is that the identity that these attackers are targeting is that admin account, and whether it's cloud or whether it's on premise, right? Like that's their target, and it's just a free for all right now with who can actually be able to get that, because most of the time it's just gonna be username and password once you get past the front gates. And so that's the thing that's crazy to me right now is that, and Jordan and I joke about this from time to time, where it's like, you don't hack into companies anymore. You log in, right? And that it starts with trying to figure out like what's the right accounts to try to go after. Yeah. And once we get there, let's figure out how you have to authenticate to that and how we have to try to bypass whether it's MFA or whatever it might be. And so that's why I think the core of everything that you really should be thinking about in modern security is the identity and how you protect that.
I agree. And I think identity is inherently a very weak link because the underlying governance around it that actually informs the way you set up the structure is terrible. And the bigger the company is, the harder it is, right? You have proliferation of departments, titles, roles. There isn't really even a central authority. It's nothing against HR people, but they are not the central authority for defining who does what and what they need to do their job. That's actually defined independently across a number of different departments, even sub-departments. And of course, the more senior you are, the less challenge there is to your requests for access to things. It's very complicated, and that makes identity and access management just an inherently weak point and a great place for people to focus if they want to cause trouble.
Yeah, and I think you're right on that. We always have our trite marketing slogans, and they say before it was the endpoint is the new edge, and now it's identity is the new edge. And so I guess it might be a fun mental activity. We don't have to do it now, but is there something past identity? Is there something past who you are? I don't know. It's maybe a question for another thing. But all that to say is that we try to be applicable on this show and talk about how can we leverage these things. And I think now that we've established, right, identity really is the crown jewel that the attackers are after, right? They're after that authorized account that they can use to go wherever they want in the environment. So maybe Jordan, start, from your perspective, what do you guys see as trends right now, or what are you constantly pounding the table on with your customers, things that you're seeing? What are attackers leveraging? Where are they finding weak spots? What are things that are commonly misconfigured that we can start going after to help secure our environments? The low-hanging fruit, as it were.
Yep.
Yeah, I'll mention one thing for sure, and that's I'll call it service account abuse. Okay. We can find this either through different assessments we do, but on the monitoring side, we monitor for these service accounts that admins or others in the IT department are setting up for their convenience, and without the authorization really of the central authority, and they're logging in, in ways that they shouldn't be. Those accounts are not properly protected, and so we're basically setting ourselves up to flag that and send it back to the company we're monitoring to say, like, this is coming from the IT department, right? Right. You've got people inside the department who, for their convenience, and who should know better, are setting up all kinds of weak service accounts, and you need to know and you need to shut them down. It comes up when these companies are audited. That's one of the things the auditors are looking at, right? Is can you detect that, and are you able to get ahead of it? So that's something we pound the table about all the time. Good companies are aware of this, and they're asking if they're monitoring themselves or if they have someone monitoring them, they're looking at that.
Yeah, the identity governance, right? They're practicing identity governance.
Yeah.
Yeah, you see those shared accounts, right? There's some products out in the market that make it helpful, but ideally you'll have just-in-time accounts are even better, but you're supposed to have individual, credentials for each admin, right? So, well, I think we were talking about this recently. I think we'll see a lot more like multi-sig, which is like almost borrowing a term from like the crypto universe, where it's like the nuclear football, right? You got to have multiple keys to start it. So we're going down that road, but identity governance for sure, Jesse. Jason, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, a couple things. One, I absolutely love that Google is starting to go down that route where you're going to have two separate admins to do critical things. Right. Like that has to happen. As somebody who has tried to jerry rig these things together via other mechanisms, like even just trying to protect like root accounts and stuff like that, sigh of relief there. We need more of that. For me, I feel like probably 10% of the posts that I put on LinkedIn are around MFA, because it's this classic thing in security where we start to say you need to have MFA, and there's always a but after it, right? It's like you have to have MFA, but you have to make sure you're using the right form of MFA. And this is the thing that it's really hard to keep up with, right? Because even though MFA is I was going to say a simple concept, but we still struggle with it as a community. Even it's a simple concept at its core. The problem is that attackers have really caught up to at least 80% of the MFA technologies that are out there, right? And scale in a scalable fashion. There are phishing kits out there that will bypass your one-time passwords, SMS. You have SIM swap attacks with SMS. Push-based authentication, you have MFA fatigue attacks. And so, we've kind of like found ourselves in this corner now where the most viable option is the use of either passkeys or some sort of FIDO2 compliant MFA device, like a YubiKey or something along those lines. And we're anchored back with this legacy of what strong MFA is, right? Because every time I go to Sony and say, don't do SMS. Don't even think about app-based anymore. If you're early on in your journey of deploying these MFA in your organization, or you're ready to invest in more, just go straight towards passkeys or go straight towards a YubiKey, whatever it is. And everyone always says, "Oh yeah, but that's really hard to do, and it's costly." And it's just it's not. It's really not anymore. Like so many of these larger companies have been deploying. I think it's Discord, I think, had a beautiful blog post about their journey in deploying YubiKeys to their entire organization, which is a remote first organization.
Right.
And they talked about all these little tricks that they used and little hacks that they got to just make it so much easier. And when you look at the end result of this, the people that in these companies that are deploying this type of technology out, they're not dealing with accounts that are getting taken over anymore because it's phishing resistant built in.
Right.
And so that's why for me, it's like when I see companies that are going through these MFA projects, because there's still tons of companies that still are not using MFA, which baffles me in 2023, but we're here. And then they just start with the weakest form of MFA, right? Like, let's just skip to the finish line and get something that's solid in place and is going to help protect you for the next at least 5 years. So that's I cannot talk enough about that because it's just crazy.
Yeah, and if you don't follow Jason and you're on this show, I mean, the videos are awesome. I was going to show one earlier, but it's a 45-second to 2-minute snippet, and as you said, what's the best MFA? What are the advantages, disadvantages? Like, he's breaking it down super quick. Awesome sound effects and the whole 9 yards. But YubiKeys, is there any risk that they can be almost intercepted? I think people kind of are like, anything you stick in a USB drive sounds dangerous to me, right? So it's like, I don't know, is there any way to intercept it in the mail and replace it, or is there risks involved into YubiKeys at all, right? Because there is a little bit of a USB bias, don't stick that in there, people said don't do that,
Right.
Yeah, and I think there's, listen, to say that the risk is zero would be a lie, right? There's always some sort of risk. I think when you compare it against the other risks that are out there, right, it's negligible. And assume it this way, right? If we're in a position where we're using app-based authentication with a one-time password, or we're using push-based, your users are just going to be more likely to click through a phishing email, enter those creds in, and fall prey to an adversary in the middle attack. It's happening all the time right now. YubiKeys, though, the attack surface is a lot smaller, right? And so while there's theoretical attacks against YubiKeys, I've had to argue with super nerds before about these theoretical attacks on YubiKeys. It's just great. The one person or one country in the world that can pull this off 1% of the time to bypass a YubiKey, great. They've won the trophy there. But for 99.99999% of all the other attacks out there, you're going to be in a really good spot, right? I'm putting my money on that one. Yeah. So theoretical attacks, yes, but practical, not really. And for if there's ever concerns over plugging in the USB, most modern laptops today have a TPM installed where you can just use the biometrics in there and store everything you need, the actual private key there, And then you're just using your finger, your face, whatever, to unlock that, to authenticate. So that's where I think like technology has finally caught up with us, and we've just forgotten to celebrate. And so like now it's just like, oh, passkeys, great, that sounds cool. Maybe we'll do it tomorrow, right? But like this is the stuff that we really need to be investing in to help stop at least the first like step in so many attacks that are out there.
Yeah.
It's a good point too, Jason, which is that, a lot of companies really are at the beginning of the journey. They have not invested. And it does make sense to go right to this kind of a solution, not just with respect to MFA, but others as well. Because it's a lot easier when you have nothing to adopt the most recent, the best practice thing, as long as it's practical from a cost perspective. I just did diligence on a company for a private equity firm, cyber diligence. The first interview I did with the owner of the business, he said, yeah, we don't have anything. We know we don't. We're not focused on this. Hasn't really been important, but we want to do something. And so in the readout of that report, I said, look, there's good news. There's bad news and good news. The bad news is they have nothing. The good news is they have nothing. It's a blank canvas, right? So we can really come in there and quickly make a huge difference that will benefit them, not just from a security perspective, but they'll be able to get some insurance, and you can really get a quick start given the current state of the technology.
Yeah, I want to pause because I heard some nuggets in there that I think are important for MSPs to take away as you're thinking about, again, what I pound the table on is your ICP and how that waterfalls into your specific offerings and everything that you're bringing to your clients. But I think there's some wisdom there in having an offering for deploying YubiKeys and focusing on that and using messaging on that, because just what Jordan talked about, you might have those early stage SaaS startups that need everything and are basically going to rubber stamp all your recommendations, not haggle over price, and be great to work with because they want to do the right thing, because they need to get it done for an investment round, for a buyout, for whatever the case may be. So I think there's some wisdom there in thinking about how to structure these offerings and maybe doing something that gives you some signal that not everyone is doing. So I want to follow that up because I was thinking, Jordan, anecdotally, have you seen an attack ever get past a YubiKey? And if so, I would love to hear about it. I
have not. Yeah. We've had customers with other MFA bypass attacks, but not with YubiKeys.
Yeah. I'm going to quick, we're not plugging vendors, but this isn't a vendor. So Dan Lee over at Red Cup IT, right? He's got, that's his ICP, is he focuses on like Silicon Valley startup software companies and fintech. They do like a triple authentication where they're using YubiKeys, MFA, and then identity-based, with Talon and everything else.
Yeah.
And he's got this great story of this year, I think it was at Black Hat. He took a laptop to Black Hat with a sign that said, "Hack me." And people would come up and ask how it was set up, and he would tell them, and they'd be like, "Nah, it's too hard." And then they'd walk away.
I do remember that.
So, I mean, that's huge right there, right? So, again, these are things to start thinking about and structuring offerings around, and chasing those desirable type of customers and relationships.
Well, and I think too, what's really important, and Jordan, I'd love to get your perspective on this, is like when you're talking to companies, I think like we tend to think like, oh, they don't have some of these basic security controls, they must be like a brand new startup, right? It's just like, no. Typically when like you're having these conversations, they're fairly far along in their journey, maybe a couple years, but these are people who need help, have maybe a small budget. And even when they're starting from scratch, that doesn't mean that their company is like 3 days old.
Not at all. If you kind of extricate yourself from the world that we live in and go into the real world for a minute, business people are running businesses. Yeah. Most of them are not running cybersecurity businesses. Yeah. The only place I've ever been where that was confusing for me was Citigroup. I went to a pitch there, and it was in the boardroom in their SOC. That looked like it could be a cybersecurity company. That's the only place I ever thought that. Most of these businesses, and it's what this owner said to me. He said, I know I'm not doing anything. It really just hasn't been that important. Now, you could say that's naive, and there is a certain naivete to it, but he's trying to make money doing what he does, right? So he's going to spend on what he needs to spend on. He has 70 reps in the field, each one with their own device. He has no control over the devices. These are salespeople, so who knows what's going on, but they're selling stuff. That's what he cares about. Right. And I spent a minute being shocked about it. And then I thought about it. I said, no. And if we're going to help this guy, right, we've got to meet him where he is. It doesn't matter what I think is the right thing for him at this moment. That's where he is. Let's find 2-3 things you could do right now that would not cost too much money and make a difference.
Yeah, I think that is just a brilliant point. And I was thinking about this morning, actually, on my drive from dropping the kids off at school. Is like everybody is talking about the MGM breach in LinkedIn in the echo chamber that I'm in, because it's all security people, it's all MSPs. And I thought for a second, I was like, I bet you 85 to 90% of business owners, it didn't even register for them. So you go talking like, well, you know what happened with the MGM breach? And they're like, no, and I don't care because it's a casino and it has nothing to do with my business. So is it really that wise to be talking about it that way? So I think it's a brilliant observation.
I mean, for your MSPs that listen, are listening, we're doing the same thing, right? We're trying to sell whatever it is, IT or security or combination of the two to our customers. And when I'm talking to my customers, the first thing I ask them about is, what does your business do?
Yeah.
Right. I really need to understand what you do and how you do it if I'm going to be able to be of any help to you.
Absolutely.
Regardless of what it is that I provide.
Yeah.
That's a theme of ours, right, Jesse?
I was going to say, are you sure you haven't watched the show before?
Yeah. Right. And then like that kind of goes down this road, Jordan. Once you understand what they do, you can start to understand the data flows, what data is important. You can start to understand, like, hey, by the way, like you want to protect that data because X, Y, and Z will happen if you don't. And then you start to get into that kind of like engaged conversation. If you start with the cybersecurity first, mine shut off. That's it.
Right.
Freeze all motor functions, Westworld, right? Like, forget it. This is an area of expertise, right? Is really how do you look at any problem, but cybersecurity in this case as a business risk. And to really be able to understand that, you have to understand what the business does. Jason and I were talking about this a few minutes ago, that if you can get people into that conversation and connect what's happening on the technology side to what I think we would call value at risk, all of a sudden it becomes more relevant.
Yep.
This might be an unpopular opinion, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. I despise the phrase, you have to build a security culture. And it seems antithesis to, like, as I'm a security person, right? But it goes to what Jordan was talking about before. Like, you have to meet people where they are. And, you have this security mindset is a beautiful thing because it does help eliminate risk. The problem here is that in this security mindset, we try to operate in a world without physics, and it doesn't work. Right. And so when we are dealing with the reality that businesses exist to do business, and they have to be able to operate, right? That's where it's just like, how do you, as a security practitioner, how do you meet them where they are, bring security with you, and almost make security be imperceptible, right? Like, how do they stay safe without knowing that they're even staying safe, but knowing what they have to do, right? It is important for your entire organization to know how to spot a phishing email. It's important for them to report these things to the security team. But if that's what you're relying on in of itself to stay secure, you have already lost. And that's where, like, security awareness training, beautiful thing. But if I have $1 to spend on security, I'm only spending 5 cents on security awareness training. And I'm planning that rest of the 95 cents on when that user eventually clicks through something or does something they didn't know about, because it's going to happen. And like, that's like, to me, that's security. That's not culture. That is really just enabling the business to succeed in spite of itself.
Wow. So so it's wild that you're saying that, because again, this is a thought I had before, which I was just kind of rolling things around the head before the call today. And I said, it's really hard to determine that risk between the end user factor and the control. And so I was thinking about, it might be, you might have access to this, actuary tables of what's the percentage of click-through rate, and then what's the percentage of stopping a threat for a security software, and the intersection of those is kind of where our risk and spend should be. So it's an interesting algorithm. My mind is not smart enough to process it in real time, but I think there's something there. So, and it's also with the security culture thing. I love what Heather said on the show last week, is that security is a value, not a culture, right? And so you have to have culture, and we talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And if you're not getting past that level 3 of needs, you're never going to have security, because people don't have their basic safety needs met. So they really don't care. Like this business owner, he doesn't care about security because he's got to pay the bills. And until the bills are paid and that existential threat is met, he's not going to care about the next threat up the stack, right? So it's just interesting and some great points there.
So there's a little bit, and I was actually in a roundtable with Jordan, I think last week or the week before. And you know, I wasn't always in security, right? So, and I'm reading Elon's book that just came out last week, right? And I'm like, I'm sure he hates security, right? Right? When you think about innovation, right? And Jason just talked about like, what does the business do? Well, what did the business do yesterday? And that might not be the same thing it's doing today. Mm-hmm. And we also had John Harden on last week, and he talked about shadow IT, and he's like, most of the time, people aren't doing this trying to sneak something away. They're just trying to do their job. So, how do you build security that's flexible enough, right? And as Jason also made a great point, like if something can work, no matter if the company's innovative or not, great. But some of that like whitelisting and allow listing things, like that gets to be a very complex conversation. And it's funny enough, Jordan also mentioned like the Big Four, and we both worked in the Big Four, and we remember logging into our computers. It takes like 15 minutes, right? Like you're gonna like VPN, firewall, like another key and this and that, right? So like the frictionless aspects of it are really something that pisses off Elon, I'm sure, right? Like that's where it gets really difficult. And I think there's actually a lot of insights from that shadow IT perspective, like what are people using to do their job? Like how are they changing? So that's like the big counter argument. And I would say the majority of security people have that risk hat on, and they're not really interested in that innovative, like innovation aspect of things. And like, it's easy to be Dr. No, and Tim's not here right now. He calls himself Dr. No, and everyone called him Dr. No at the MSP he used to work at. So it's really hard not to get out of that, because it's just so easy to say no, or like these are the rules, this is compliance, this is the governance.
I think there's a misperception though, and I'd be interested, Jason, if you'd agree, right? Just saying you're going to look at something from a risk perspective doesn't mean the answer is no. Right. The core part of when you're analyzing risk is, why are we doing this? Is it worth taking this risk? And if you need to be able to be successful in your business, then we will take that risk. Then you go to question 2, which is, what are the compensating controls? Right? Do we understand what risk we're taking? How much of it can we mitigate? And whatever we're retaining, can we buy insurance or do other things to try to make sure we're going to be covered if something bad happens? Right. And I think that's if you think of risk management or thinking of things from a risk perspective as just the way you're going to get to the answer no, then you're actually missing the opportunity to use that way of thinking to enable innovation inside the organization. Every innovation is a risk.
And those simple techniques are what MSPs should be using to quote unquote sell cyber, because you're not really selling it. You're just helping the business identify and mitigate its risk. And if you look at it that way, it becomes an easy sale, right? You know, we're getting short on time here, Tim, and we I could go for another hour on this.
You started talking about like kind of also using security to understand the customer. That's one kind of recurring theme on this show. Right. Because if you understand the customer, you can sell them RPA and analytics or whatever, right? Like or some proprietary software the law firm needs. Like you're only going to find that out if you're asking them the deep questions. And as Jordan said, like, what does the business do? And like, what do they want to do? So that's where security, you can kind of use that as a cheat to know everything about the business. You should be knowing everything about the business anyway, but that's where you see those clear wins and that clear engagement as well. Like, oh, there's something else I'm not doing and that my competitors are doing. Like, show me the new trick. So go ahead, Jesse. Sorry.
No, I feel like we just scratched the surface and we could go another hour. I wanted to get from maybe each of you gentlemen. What's an incident that really stands out in your mind that was maybe based on identity or an authorization faux pas or misstep that just crushed a business? And you don't have to tell me who the business was, of course. Don't want to get anyone in trouble here, but I would love to give the MSPs watching this just a couple of stories to use in their conversations with their customers as not a scare tactic, but a way to tie legitimate happenings to the products they're selling.
You want to go first, Jason?
Yeah, I'm laughing because as I was
with 1,000 breaches, like this must have been the mother of all like slam dunks. Yeah.
This is my favorite one tied to identity because it just shows how one misconfiguration creates a very bad day for an entire company. And so this is a very large company, and when I say very large company, I mean a very, 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 very large company, like hundreds of thousands of employees. Okay, and that number is important. Because there was an incident, and what we found as we were investigating was we're looking at what's happening on these systems, and we're like, how is this user able to do this? It doesn't make sense. They shouldn't be able to execute this particular file in a manner that they did and have it succeed. And so we saw this popping up probably 4 or 5 times in the span of probably 10 systems that we were investigating out of a very large amount. And finally, we started asking some more questions around it. And as we start digging into it, we realized that somebody had inadvertently configured Active Directory so that every single user in the entire organization was essentially a domain administrator.
Wow.
So the attacker may not have even known this, right? And so they were going through their normal playbook. But literally, the second that attacker got access to one system, they had domain admin without having to really do anything. Wow. And so that just went from bad to just very bad in a very short amount of time because of that. Whereas, if you have these things configured properly, the attacker has to take a very specific series of steps to escalate their privilege, which gives you as a defender more time to try to detect them. But when you basically let them into into Active Directory right away, and basically give them the keys of the kingdom right off the bat, like you're not really doing yourself any favors.
Yeah, and as you were talking about that, I think that's a great argument for the YubiKey thing, right? You talked about how it's really hard to implement to MFA for device log in Windows Active Directory. Well, with YubiKeys, that's actually becomes a little bit easier to stop that. So even that misconfiguration could have potentially been stopped by a YubiKey deployment.
Potentially. I think the real weakness right now with this technology is non-interactive logons, right? So even though if I can get onto a system and drop a piece of malware, I have the right creds, I can just PowerShell into other systems. And there's just, outside of microsegmentation, which is a good recommendation, ties into zero trust, right? Yeah. With the absence of that, it's really difficult. And this is why security is such a hard game, because it's just like the odds are completely stacked against you to try to do this the way that really would help reduce risk.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I can. I'll tell you one that we're working on right now.
Okay.
It has to do more with privilege than identity, let's say.
Okay.
But this is a public sector entity with thousands and thousands of people involved, employees and stakeholders. And at some point, for what they believed was a good, solid operational reason, they had a lot of their stakeholder account passwords in clear text on a server that was internet facing with no protection. Fast forward, about halfway through their pain, they realized that the 2 most senior employees in the IT department who are aware of this are exploiting this. They're also using their own privileged access to escalate privilege further, create all kinds of backdoors. Fast forward a little more, they're in cahoots with outside threat actors.
Wow.
There's crypto mining, there's, all kinds of records being exfiltrated. They're on the verge of a ransomware attack that gets stopped just in the nick of time. They complete investigation number 2, costing them, they're into the hundreds of thousands of dollars now. They take a deep breath, everything's fine, and then it just starts all over again.
Right.
Because the way that people's privileges, the lack of monitoring for how there was movement, how privileges were being escalated, there was nothing.
Yeah.
And once it started, it was almost impossible to stop, even after 2 very expensive, sophisticated investigations.
Wow.
Because whoever was doing it had enough privilege that they could see, they could hear, because they were in the department, what was about to happen, and they could do whatever they needed to maintain their place so that they could pick up where they left off after any mitigating steps were taken.
Wow.
So that this lack of attention to privilege management, keeping people's identities and passwords where they should be, just basic hygiene. It's very sad for a public sector entity to find itself in that position.
Yep.
I think, and I think it speaks to both, right? So you mentioned insurance, right? If you don't have these mitigating controls in place, not only are you not able to protect and see what's happening, which was why these actors were so brazen, because they knew there was nothing watching them that could catch them, right? So if you know there's potential for a trail, then hey, maybe it's like fences make good neighbors type of thing, right? So good fences make good neighbors. Raymond Devine, I saw him say that the other day, so I'll give him a shout out for that. But and then you can't get insurance because you don't have the controls. And so again, you go through these expensive, and that's just draining your coffers when it should be something that the insurance companies are helping you mitigate and paying for through the policy. So I think it becomes a downward spiral the less you do. So interesting. Tim, you want to close us out or let us know what we got for next week?
Yeah, 5 minutes left. We'll just do closing thoughts. And next week is an interesting expert testimony, cyber criminologist.
Wow.
Sounds like Jason is a part-time cyber criminologist himself. He's been deposed, maybe not on purpose, but maybe maybe not hired.
Enough for that. I know I don't need to do that again.
You probably didn't get paid for that, but so yeah, so that we've got that. He's also a professor at BU in cybersecurity, so that'll be interesting as well. But yeah, closing thoughts from everyone. Why don't we start with Jordan?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Jesse, going back to your comment about the MSPs, and I spend 75% of my time working with MSPs, trying to collaborate with them to help their customers. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of good we can do when we collaborate. Most of the stuff that I find in my assessments of our customers has to be remediated by an MSP. It's not work that we're going to do. Hands-on keyboard. And so that thought process, whether it's about identity or any of the other topics we covered, being at the front end of that with a customer who trusts you to manage their IT environment, those are great conversations to have, and great ways to add value in that relationship.
Yeah.
Awesome. Jason.
Yeah, I'll piggyback off of that. I think security starts with an MSP, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everything today is driven by IT, whether that's an on-premise environment, whether that's cloud, whether that's SaaS. And it's too complex for most businesses to really understand. And so the more value that you can drive and differentiator that you can drive to highlight that it's not only a usable solution, something that's going to enable the business, but also not hinder them in the future because of, pretty common attacks out there that could have been avoidable. You got to bring that to the forefront. And so I think every company out there is begging for that assistance and just begging for what are the right things to do and what's the right order. And so the more value that we can drive there, the better off we all are. Right. I work as somebody working in a cyber insurance carrier. We're here to help through the mistakes. Right. But we want to try to make sure we minimize the number of mistakes at the same time.
Yeah. Awesome. Jesse, your turn.
Yeah. I guess I want to say that I do think I was kind of a loaded question is that I do think authorization and identity is the core of security. And so I think when you approach it that way and you find out what people need to do what when in the business, as Jordan mentioned, you're going to be able to build some right-sized security solutions for your clients. And again, what Jason said, there is no way that a small or medium enterprise or business can economically deliver efficient cybersecurity operations in this day and age. I think that's my opinion. And so MSPs, you have to own that. You have to understand that and realize that you are the experts for your customers and they need this and they want this and you're the ones to do it for them. So I guess maybe a little bit of an inspiration to go out there and really go after it with these YubiKeys and everything else.
Yeah, that was my takeaway from the show. And Jason said, like, the YubiKey thing just sounds like a no-brainer. It's cheap. Yeah. It's not frictionless on the user. If it can stop a great majority of attacks, it sounds like Jordan doesn't even know of one. So it sounds like, you know, this magic cheat right now, and let's just lean on it until something happens, right? So that was some great advice, and follow Jason's videos, and there's some great, you know, talking about why YubiKeys and things like that. So guys, Jason, Jordan, Jesse, thanks for coming on. Awesome show, and hopefully we'll do it again in a couple months.
Absolutely.
Let's do it. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.